A parliamentary system is a system of democratic governance of a state where the executive branch derives its democratic legitimacy from legislature, and is also held accountable to that legislature. In a parliamentary system, the head of state is normally a different person from the head of government. This is in contrast to a presidential system in a democracy, where the head of state often is also the head of government, and most importantly, the executive branch does not derive its democratic legitimacy from the legislature. Countries with parliamentary systems may be constitutional monarchies, where a monarch is the head of state while the head of government is almost always a member of the legislature, or parliamentary republics, where a mostly ceremonial president is the head of state while the head of government is regularly from the legislature. In a few parliamentary republics, such as Botswana, South Africa and Suriname, as well as German states, the head of government is also head of state, but is elected by and is answerable to the legislature. History. The first parliaments date back to the Middle Ages. For example, in 1188 Alfonso IX, King of Leon, convened the three states in the Cortes of Leon. The modern concept of prime ministerial government originated in the Kingdom of Great Britain and its contemporary, the parliamentary system in Sweden. In 1714, Prince-Elector George Ludwig of Hanover, Germany, acceded to the throne of Great Britain after his cousin Queen Anne died with no heirs of her body. As King George I, he chaired the cabinet and chose ministers of the government. However, he initially spoke no English. This shifted the balance of power towards the leading minister, or first minister, who de facto chaired the cabinet. During his reign, Parliament's role in controlling government and in deciding who the king could ask to form a government gradually increased. Towards the end of his reign, actual power was held by Sir Robert Walpole, who evolved as Britain's first prime minister over the years from 1721 to 1742. Later, the Great Reform Act of 1832 broadened the franchise and was accompanied by increasing parliamentary dominance, with Parliament always deciding who was prime. Characteristics. A parliamentary system may use bicameralism with two chambers of parliament, an elected lower house, and an upper house, a senate which may be appointed or elected by a different mechanism from the lower house. Another possibility is unicameralism with just one parliamentary chamber. Scholars of democracy such as Arendlage distinguish two types of parliamentary democracies, the Westminster and consensus systems. The Westminster system is usually found in the Commonwealth of nations and countries which were influenced by the British political tradition. These parliaments tend to have a more adversarial style of debate, and the plenary session of Parliament is more important than committees. Some parliaments in this model are elected using a plurality voting system, such as the United Kingdom, Canada, and India, while others use proportional representation, such as Ireland and New Zealand. The Australian House of Representatives is elected using instant runoff voting, while the Senate is elected using proportional representation through single transferable vote. Regardless of which system is used, the voting systems tend to allow the voter to vote for a named candidate rather than a closed list. The Western European parliamentary model tends to have a more consensual debating system, and usually has semicircular debating chambers. Consensus systems have more of a tendency to use proportional representation with open party lists than the Westminster model legislatures. The committees of these parliaments tend to be more important than the plenary chamber. Some West European countries' parliaments implement the principle of dualism as a form of separation of powers. In countries using this system, members of parliament have to resign the place in parliament upon being appointed minister. Ministers in those countries usually actively participate in parliamentary debates, but are not entitled to vote. Implementations of the parliamentary system can also differ on the manner of how the Prime Minister and government are appointed and as to whether the government needs the explicit approval of the Parliament, rather than just the absence of its disapproval. Some countries such as India also require the Prime Minister to be a member of the legislature, though in other countries this only exists as a convention. The head of state appoints a Prime Minister who will likely have majority support in Parliament, while in practice most Prime Ministers under the Westminster system are the leaders of the largest party in Parliament. Technically, the appointment of the Prime Minister is a prerogative exercised by the monarch, the Governor-General, or the President. No parliamentary vote takes place on who is forming a government, but since Parliament can immediately defeat the government with a motion of no confidence, the head of state is limited by convention to choosing a candidate who can command the confidence of Parliament and has little or no influence in the decision. The head of state appoints a prime minister who must gain a vote of confidence within a set time. Example: Italy, Thailand. The head of state appoints the leader of the political party with the majority of the seats in the parliament as prime minister. Example: Greece, where in the case of no party has a majority, then the leader of the party with a plurality of seats is given an exploratory mandate to receive the confidence of the parliament within 3 days. If this is not possible, then the leader of the party with the second highest seat number is given the exploratory mandate. If this fails, then the leader of the third largest party is given it, and so on. The head of state nominates a candidate for prime minister who is then submitted to Parliament for approval before appointment as prime minister. Example: Spain, where the king sends a nomination to Parliament for approval. Also, Germany, where under the German Basic Law the Bundestag votes on a candidate nominated by the federal president. In these cases, Parliament can choose another candidate who then would be appointed by the head of state. Parliament nominates a candidate who the head of state is then constitutionally obliged to appoint as prime minister. Example: Japan, where the emperor appoints the prime minister on the nomination of the Diet. Also, Ireland, where the president of Ireland appoints the Taoiseach on the nomination of the Dáil. A public office holder nominates a candidate who, if approved by Parliament, is appointed as prime minister. Example: under the Swedish instrument of government, the power to appoint someone to form a government has been moved from the monarch to the Speaker of Parliament and the Parliament itself. The Speaker nominates a candidate, who is then elected to Prime Minister by the Parliament if an absolute majority of the members of Parliament does not vote no. Direct election by popular vote. Example: Israel, 1996 to 2001, where the Prime Minister was elected in a general election with no regard to political affiliation. Furthermore, there are variations as to what conditions exist for the government to have the right to dissolve the parliament. In some countries like Denmark, Malaysia, Australia and New Zealand, the Prime Minister has the de facto power to call an election at will. This was also the case in the United Kingdom until the passage of the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act 2011. In Israel, Parliament may vote in order to call an election a passive vote of no confidence against the government. Other countries only permit an election to be called in the event of a vote of no confidence against the government, a supermajority vote in favor of an early election, or prolonged deadlock in Parliament. These requirements can still be circumvented. For example, in Germany in 2005, Gerhard Schröder deliberately allowed his government to lose a confidence motion in order to call an early election. In Sweden, the government may call a snap election at will, but the newly elected Riksdag is only elected to fill out the previous Riksdag's term. The last time this option was used was in 1958. Norway is unique among parliamentary systems in that the Storting always serves the whole of its 4-year term. The parliamentary system can be contrasted with a presidential system which operates under a stricter separation of powers, whereby the executive does not form part of, nor is appointed by, the parliamentary legislative body. In such a system, parliaments or congresses do not select or dismiss heads of governments, and governments cannot request an early dissolution as may be the case for parliaments. There also exists the semi-presidential system that draws on both presidential systems and parliamentary systems by combining a powerful president with an executive responsible to parliament, as for example the French Fifth Republic. Parliamentarism may also apply to regional and local governments. An example is the city of Oslo, which has an executive council as a part of the parliamentary system. A few parliamentary democratic nations such as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., have enacted a law, i.e., anti-defection law, which prohibits floor crossing or switching the party after election process. With this law, the elected representative have to lose the seat in the Parliament House if they defy the direction of the party in any voting. Advantages and disadvantages. One of the commonly attributed advantages to parliamentary systems is that it is faster and easier to pass legislation, as the executive branch is formed by the direct or indirect support of the legislative branch and often includes members of the legislature. Thus, the executive has a majority of the votes and can pass legislation at will. In a presidential system, the executive is often chosen independently from the legislature. If the executive and the majority of the legislature are from different political parties, then stalemate can occur. Thus, the executive might not be able to implement its legislative proposals. An executive in any system is chiefly voted into office on the basis of his or her party's platform, manifesto, and the same is also true of the legislature. In addition to quicker legislative action, parliamentary government has attractive features for nations that are ethnically, racially, or ideologically divided. In a presidential system, all executive power is vested in one person, the president. In a parliamentary system, with a collegial executive, power is more divided. In the 1989 Lebanese TAIF agreement, in order to give Muslims greater political power, Lebanon moved from a semi-presidential system with a strong president to a system more structurally similar to classical parliamentary government. Iraq similarly disdained a presidential system out of fears that such a system would be tantamount to Shiite domination. Afghanistan's minorities refused to go along with a presidency as strong as the Pashtuns desired. It can also be argued that power is more evenly spread out in parliamentary government. The Prime Minister is seldom as important as a ruling president, and there tends to be a higher focus on voting for a party and its political ideas than voting for an actual person. In his 1867 book The English Constitution, Walter Bagehot praised parliamentary government for producing serious debates, for allowing change in power without an election, and for allowing elections at any time. Bagehot considered the four-year election rule of the United States to be unnatural. Some scholars like Juan Lintz, Frederick Spruce Ackerman, and Robert Dahl claimed that parliamentary government is less prone to authoritarian collapse. These scholars point out that since World War II, two-thirds of Third World countries establishing parliamentary governments successfully made the transition to democracy. By contrast, no Third World presidential system successfully made the transition to democracy without experiencing coups and other constitutional breakdowns. A recent World Bank study found that parliamentary systems are associated with less corruption. Some constituencies may have a popular local candidate under an unpopular leader, forcing a difficult choice on the electorate. Mixed-member proportional representation can make this choice easier by allowing voters to cast one one vote for the local candidate but also cast a second vote for another party. Although Bagehot praised parliamentary government for allowing an election to take place at any time, the lack of a definite election calendar can be abused. Previously, under some systems, such as the British, a ruling party could schedule elections when it felt that it was likely to retain power, and so avoid elections at times of unpopularity. Thus, by wise timing of elections, in a parliamentary system a party can extend its rule for longer than is feasible in a functioning presidential system. This problem can be alleviated somewhat by setting fixed dates for parliamentary elections, as is the case in several of Australia's state parliaments. In other systems, such as the Dutch and the Belgian, the ruling party or coalition has some flexibility in determining the election date. Conversely, flexibility in the timing of parliamentary elections can avoid periods of legislative gridlock that can occur in a fixed-period presidential system. Critics of the Westminster parliamentary system point out that people with significant popular support in the community are prevented from becoming Prime Minister if they cannot get elected to Parliament, since there is no option to run for Prime Minister as one can run for President under a presidential system. Additionally, Prime Ministers may lose the positions if they lose the seats in Parliament, even though they may still be popular nationally. Supporters of parliamentary government respond by saying that as members of Parliament, Prime Ministers are elected first to represent their electoral constituents, and if they lose the support, then consequently they are no longer entitled to be Prime Minister. Countries